Hey, good morning and Merry Christmas to all my friends and listeners out there. Hey, this is Jim Sidor. It is Christmas morning, and I wanted to do a very special Christmas teaching on the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, the Christmas story. And most Bible teachers, most preachers, most pastors get this thing so wrong. And I was one of them until I came across a guy by the name of Doug Greenwald, who Doug passed away in 2019 unexpectedly in his 60s, but he left for us some really, really amazing information. And one of the things that Doug Greenwald was famous for was putting the Bible in its proper context. And most people don't do that. Luke 2, for example, says that there was no room for them in the inn, or no room for them in the inn. That is a mistake. Actually, that's how almost every contemporary Bible translates Luke 2:7. When you look at the word in the English translation, you think of, like a Ramada or a Motel 6 that's in, your town by the highway. So not only is that not true, in Luke's text, or actually in his context, but it keeps Christians from understanding the real glory and wonder and significance of the coming of Jesus Christ. So, to more fully appreciate that first Christmas, once I saw what Doug Greenwald had found out himself, I do what I normally do when I find something that interests me. I get every piece of information I can about it, and I start looking at it. That's exactly what I did here. I really want to take a deep dive into the Gospel of Luke, the passages that everybody's familiar with, right? So, if you open up your Bible to Luke 2 and get yourself a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen and take some notes, because you're going to want to understand this also. This is what really happened, right? Prior to Jesus' birth, Luke deliberately tells us that Mary and Joseph have been in Bethlehem for some time. It says it right there. It says, while they were there, the time for the baby was to be born. Now, it doesn't say when they arrived in Bethlehem or where they stayed until it was time for birth. But one thing is clear. They didn't arrive in Bethlehem that night. They were there for a while. It could have been a couple of days, could have been a couple of months. So Luke gives us some clues as to what's going on there in Bethlehem when he deliberately uses the Greek word kataluma in Luke 2:7. And most translators translate that as inn, but it's not. It's not, or hotel. But that's not really what the word means. Contextually, kataluma is a guest room. Now, there are people that would argue that kataluma could also mean a hotel or an inn, but that's a very loose translation of it. If you go into the archaeology of Jewish towns during that period of time, most inns or hotels, just like here in the United States and throughout the world, are located in populated areas, right? And in biblical time, during the time of Jesus, uh, most of the hotels were located on major trade routes in first century Palestine. They were located, probably 20 miles apart in most towns on a major trade route. And that's about the average that a caravan of camels could travel in those days, or horses. During Jesus' time, inns, hotels were usually round, hedgerow type things, about 60 feet in diameter. A big circular walled space that was open to the sky. That was an inn. That was a hotel. And in those establishments, it was overseen by an innkeeper or a hotel manager. There were no rooms to rent. There was no privacy. One common area, the inns were, like almost like a biker bar type of thing, you know? Lots of bad people around because this is an area of commerce. And there's bad people, robbers, roughnecks, bikers, landed in these lodging areas. Luke makes reference to these kinds of places when he uses the word pendoxion. The same word is used in the story of the Good Samaritan. But one thing is clear. No self-respecting person is ever going to bring a pregnant woman to one of those places. No way. You're not going to go to a pendoxion to give birth. So where would you go? Well, in most cities and towns in Palestine, the way of life in Judaism was to provide hospitality to strangers, especially family members. Even the humblest Judean family would do that, even though many of them, or the great majority of them, if not all of them, lived in a one-family house, a one-room house. It was truly, we talk about having a family room in our house. Well, that was the family room. Parents lived there, children lived there, that's what they ate, that's where they slept. That's where everything that a normal person would do during the day was done, in that one-room house. Now, Jewish tradition held that it was forbidden for a Jewish man to sleep in the same room as another man's wife. So what did they do? If they were to have friends over, if they were to have family members come, there was a little structure on the backside of this one-room house. It was a small area created floor to ceiling generally, and it was divided off from the main house or room. It was called a kataluma, and it was a guest room where relatives could stay for however long they were going to stay. Typically, the Judean home in Israel today still looks like a first century kataluma. These places all had basements where they would keep their animals. The beauty of this would be that the animals that were staying downstairs, well, they were a little smelly, but they also provided some warmth, some heat, as they bedded down for the evening and stayed inside. So the heat would come up into the home, creating a warm place to stay. So this animal pen down there was usually dark. It didn't have any windows. It was a very small place as far as height is concerned. It was probably 4 to 5 feet. And all it really was a place for the family's animals to have protection for the night. And generally there was a feeding trough in there, a manger. Depending on where the town was, it was either hewn out of rectangular block or it was made of wood. Sometimes this feeding trough was just a depression in the floor. And in addition to protection, this basement dwelling area provided, as I said, a natural heating system during winter from the animal's body heat. So, historical information about hotels and houses were not, you really have to look at it in Luke's narrative for whatever contextual clues he gives regarding the place where Jesus was born. Now, I mentioned mandatory hospitality before. Luke reminds us that Joseph is part of David's bloodline, right? His clan lives and resides in Bethlehem. And in the Jewish culture, hospitality was mandatory, especially visiting family members, especially a pregnant woman, right, about to give birth. You know, during the time of Jesus, the population of Bethlehem was probably 2,000, 1,500 people. And if you assume that the average family size was, 2 parents and 4 to 6 children, there's probably 300 homes in Bethlehem. Each one had a cataluma, guest room. And since Mary's priority need for such a room was evident because of her being pregnant, why is it no one in the clan of Joseph, the Davidic clan, was willing to offer Mary and Joseph their cataluma? Why was there no room at the inn? It wasn't an inn. It was a house. But why was there no room? What is Luke trying to communicate to us in Luke 2:7 with the deliberate use of the word cataluma? Luke gives you a clue in Luke 2:5 when he informs us that Joseph is with Mary, his betrothed, who was expecting a child. Why does Luke repeat that fact when he already told us that in chapter 1? He's underscoring for us, by repeating this, that, her being betrothed with child is the reason no one in Bethlehem is going to offer them use of their cataluma. How come? Well, according to first century marriage customs, when Mary was betrothed to Joseph, a scribe in Nazareth would draw up a contract documenting that the two of them were now legally married as husband and wife, right? But a marriage could not be consummated until the girl began to menstruate. And don't forget, girls were very young back then when they got married, between 12 and 13 years of age generally. So when that reproductive capability became evident, there would be, after the betrothal, a multi-day wedding feast would be announced by the family, right, the clan, and invitations would go out, right, just like today. So you remember when Jesus traveled from Nazareth to Cana for the wedding of John in John 2, right? So after these wedding festivities, a bride could cohabitate with her husband, and their marriage would be sexually consummated. But now, here is Mary and Joseph arriving in the city, and Joseph likely visited Bethlehem during the summertime because he would participate in the Davidic wood offering at the temple in Jerusalem. The Davidic clan would be knowledgeable about Joseph's life, especially of his betrothal to Mary, right? Whether or not there had been a wedding feast. So, when Joseph arrives in Bethlehem for the census, along with Mary, who's extremely pregnant, what do you think the first question would be from the clan, this family of Joseph's? Well, they see Mary is pregnant, they're probably asking themselves, hey, how come we didn't get an invitation to the wedding? We probably would have traveled from Bethlehem to Nazareth to watch you guys get married. And so, when Joseph lets them know that they were not married, what would you think? That they had an adulterous relationship, right? No one's going to allow this couple inside their Cataluma because the Jewish tradition and their way of living was they were a clan of shame. Nobody's going to allow a couple living in sin to use their Cataluma. It would bring shame on their house. Their purity would not allow their home to be defiled. But there was a family who obviously or apparently were family members of Joseph and Mary who allowed them to use their basement. That was the birthplace of Jesus Christ. It wasn't out in some stable. It was in the basement of a person's home. So the contextual backdrop of the birth of Jesus is now coming into focus, right? Culturally perceived shame. The birth of Jesus, the Messiah, was glorious from heaven's perspective, but from the perspective of Joseph's clan, it was a scandal, right? A typical human reaction. And this misperception of shame never left Jesus as he was growing up. I write about that in my book that was published back in 2012, Change of Heart. And in my book, I actually have him getting into an altercation with a guy who claims that, Joseph is not his father. And James is the one that actually, in my book, James is actually the one who forces Jesus into the fight, because some guy accused James's brother of not being, a real family member, of being a bastard for all intents and purposes. So you would have to read the book to figure out how it all works out. But, getting back to this misinterpretation, his the Jewish scholars at the time and the Jewish people at the time reject Jesus as the Messiah because of his illegitimate birth, right? The characterization of Mary in the Babylonian Talmud is a harlot messing around with a carpenter. So there's an issue with Jesus growing up in shame. So let's move that idea of shame into the context of the shepherds. Luke's narrative talks about Jesus's first being announced to shepherds who were living out in the fields, keeping watch over the flocks at night, right? If you go back to Psalm 23 portrays the role of a shepherd as being a very dishonorable way of life, pastime, or job. Shepherding was viewed as, a person to be scorned, as unclean. They weren't even allowed to be jury members. And rabbis during this time held that shepherds, because of their wandering, trespassing on other people's property, could never be forgiven because they could never make retribution for their flocks eating people's grass on somebody else's land. So you really have to dig deep to appreciate Luke's birth narrative, right? Shepherds are shameful people, they're forgotten people, needy people, practicing a shameful profession. It was just this kind of hopeless person living in a chronic, cultural, shame-filled profession, when God's amazing grace directed the angels to announce the great news of the birth of the Messiah to these shepherds, right? The whole thing about shepherds is they live in this motif of shame. So starting with the birth of Jesus and continuing right through his life and his death, everything about his ministry and his life growing up and his death was shameful, right? I mean, he's crucified naked on a cross, beaten, his beard pulled out. At the beginning of his life, Jesus was born in a culturally perceived shameful circumstances, right? And his birth was announced to shepherds living the same shameful life. In his 3-year ministry, Jesus brought God's miracle of compassion, mercy, and grace to people who were systematically marginalized and excluded, right? He didn't go to the rich and the famous. He went to the poor and the sick. He rescued them from their hopelessness of sin. And as I said, at the end of his life, he died the most horrific death that anybody could possibly die. The most shameful way to die. Standing up there, arms spread out, nailed into a cross, feet nailed into a cross, totally naked. It's no wonder that those Bethlehem shepherds, were the ones that the angels picked to spread the good news. The good news wouldn't be spread by a righteous, observant Jew. They despised shepherds. Only other shepherds living in shame would ever listen to these Bethlehem shepherds that came and told them of the good news of the coming of the Messiah. Right? One shameful person to another. And when I look at this added motif of shame further enriches the meaning and significance of this incredible God coming to earth event. Yeshua, Jesus Christ, the Lord rescues. That's what Yeshua means. He's willing to come to this earth and rescue shameful people, sinful people. The next time you look at the traditional familiar Bethlehem scene, see it for the unfamiliar event it most likely was, a 13-year-old girl giving birth to the Savior of the world in a dark cave underneath a modest Judean home, being totally misunderstood by his Davidic clan there in Bethlehem. Man, one of the greatest burdens in a person's life is to be misunderstood and realize there's nothing you can do about it. How do you think Mary felt? In reality, she held the rescuer of the world, the Lord, in her arms. And I'm sure the thought went through her mind as, what's going to happen to this boy as he grows older? What's he going to have to go through? The most prevalent sound in this birth in a cellar or cave was silence. Right? Before those shepherds came to see the Lord, all they heard were the sound of animals. And every once in a while, Jesus would cry after his birth. It was the perfect setting for Mary to think about how God does things. During this Christmas season, maybe this will afford you a period of solitude and silence to think about this extraordinary scene of how Yeshua, the Lord's rescuer, came to rescue you from your issues of shame, guilt, and sin, and bring you home to be with him forever. So I hope you're getting the idea that the Bible, and especially this story here of Jesus' birth, the full message of it is not really well known. The original context of it is not really well known. Restoring this story into its proper context really allows you to better understand what happened in Bethlehem. Thank goodness I saw that teaching by Doug Greenwald about the actual context of what went on back then. You got to think about how things happened back in the time when they happened, back in the time when Jesus was born. You got to return to the original setting. The miracle of Christmas is actually much more awe-inspiring and evoking of praise, wonder, gratitude than our traditional motif, right? You put that original context in place, you're able to see and able to praise God even more, not just for what he did at Bethlehem, but also for the intentional way that he eternally chose to do it for us.